After recently losing his wife to illness, a retired history professor offers shelter to a nurse caught in a rainstorm on a desolate country road. She claims to be stranded. But as the days go by, strange coincidences and inconsistencies begin to unravel her story. What starts as kindness turns into a chilling unraveling of secrets and a past the professor thought he'd buried long ago. The storm had rolled in without warning, as if nature itself were grieving alongside Walter Granger. The wipers on his old Buick fought a futile battle against the sheets of rain that battered the windshield. At 68 years old, Walter had long since grown accustomed to driving these winding country roads alone. But tonight, they felt lonelier than ever. It had been 6 months since Margaret passed, leaving behind an emptiness in their modest farmhouse that no amount of time or distraction could fill. He missed her laugh, her gentle scolding when he forgot to take his pills, and even her insistence on airing out the attic every spring, despite his protests about dust allergies. Now, all he had left were memories, and the occasional ache in his chest when he least expected it. As he rounded a bend in the road, something caught his eye. A pale figure standing at the edge of the forest, illuminated by the intermittent flashes of lightning. Walter slowed the car, squinting through the downpour. It was a young woman, soaked to the bone, dressed in scrubs with a stethoscope still slung around her neck. She waved both arms frantically, desperation written across her face. Walter hesitated. His better judgment told him not to stop. Strangers on deserted roads late at night rarely brought good news. But there was something about her posture, something fragile and vulnerable, that tugged at his conscience. Besides, this stretch of highway wasn't exactly bustling with traffic. If he didn't help her, who would? He pulled over cautiously, rolling down the passenger side window just enough to be heard over the storm. "You okay?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, leaning closer. Her teeth chattered, and her dark hair clung to her face like seaweed. "My car broke down back there." She gestured vaguely toward the woods. "I tried walking to find help, but my phone's dead." Walter studied her for a moment longer. She looked harmless enough, young, maybe mid-20s, with wide brown eyes that seemed too innocent for trouble. Still, he couldn't shake the unease prickling at the back of his mind. But then he remembered how many times Margaret had lectured him about kindness being its own reward. "Get in," he said finally, unlocking the door. "You'll freeze out here." She climbed into the car gratefully, clutching a small tote bag close to her chest. "Thank you so much. I'm Lena, by the way." "Walter," he replied, shifting the car into gear. "Where were you headed?" Lena hesitated, brushing wet strands of hair from her forehead. "Just home. My shift ended late, and I guess I should have checked the weather before heading out." Walter nodded sympathetically. "Happens to the best of us. Listen, it's not safe to leave you stranded out here. You can stay at my place until morning. I've got a landline. We can call a tow truck first thing." Relief washed over her features. "That's incredibly kind of you, Mr. Granger. Thank you." "Call me Walter," he said gruffly, though inwardly he felt a flicker of warmth. It had been ages since anyone had needed him like this. Maybe helping someone else for a change would dull the edges of his grief, even if only for a little while. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers filling the space between them. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the car, a tentative calm settled. Walter stole glances at Lena when she wasn't looking. There was something oddly familiar about her, though he couldn't quite place it. Perhaps it was the way she sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, or the quiet strength in her voice despite her obvious discomfort. When they arrived at the farmhouse, Walter parked under the sagging porch roof and hurried around to open Lena's door. "Watch your step," he warned, guiding her up the creaky stairs. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood polish and lavender, a scent Margaret had always loved. He flipped on the lights, revealing a cozy living room cluttered with books, knickknacks, and photographs of happier days. "Make yourself comfortable," Walter said, gesturing to the worn armchair by the fireplace. "I'll get some blankets and start a fire." Lena sank into the chair, shivering slightly. "This is such a beautiful home," she murmured, taking in the framed pictures on the mantel. One photo in particular caught her eye. A younger Walter standing beside Margaret, their faces glowing with laughter. "Your wife?" "Yeah," Walter said softly, following her gaze. "That was Margaret. She passed away last year." "I'm so sorry," Lena said, her tone sincere. "She looks like she was wonderful." "She was," Walter agreed, busying himself with the logs in the hearth. For a fleeting moment he thought he saw a shadow cross Lena's face, something unreadable, almost sorrowful, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. By the time the fire crackled to life, casting golden light across the room, Walter had pushed aside his doubts. This stranger might have stumbled into his life unexpectedly, but perhaps that was exactly what he needed right now. A reminder that kindness still mattered, even in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. But as Lena settled deeper into the chair, her tote bag resting innocently at her feet, neither of them noticed the faint glow emanating from within its depths, or the secrets it carried. The guest room was modest but welcoming, much like the rest of Walter's home. Margaret had always insisted on keeping it ready for visitors, though they hadn't hosted anyone in years, not since their children grew up and moved away to cities far beyond the reach of Walter's quiet countryside life. Now, as he ushered Lena inside, Walter felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with unease. This house hadn't been built for strangers. "I'll grab you some blankets," he said, gesturing toward the neatly made bed. "There's an extra toothbrush in the bathroom down the hall if you need it." "Thank you again, Walter," Lena replied softly, setting her tote bag carefully on the dresser. Her movements were deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though she'd spent years perfecting the art of blending into unfamiliar spaces. "You've been incredibly kind." Walter nodded, managing a small smile. "It's no trouble. Get some rest, and we can figure things out in the morning." As he closed the door behind him, leaving Lena to settle in, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about her story didn't quite add up. Care homes weren't exactly scarce around here, yet he couldn't recall seeing her face before. And why would someone working at One Drive this far out of town? Still, he reminded himself not to jump to conclusions. People had their reasons for doing things, just as he had his own for taking her in. Later that night, after retiring to his bedroom and flipping through the pages of a dog-eared novel without really reading them, Walter heard it, the faint creak of floorboards outside his door. At first, he thought it might be the wind or the old house settling, but then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps padding down the hallway. He set the book aside and opened his door cautiously. There stood Lena, barefoot and pale in the dim light, staring down the corridor as though lost in thought. She turned when she heard him, startled but composed. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you," she said quickly, clutching the folds of her borrowed robe. "I was looking for the bathroom." Walter frowned slightly. "There's one right next to your room." Her expression faltered for the briefest moment, her lips parting as if searching for words. Then she recovered, offering a sheepish smile. "Of course there is. Silly me. I must have gotten turned around." Something in her tone struck him as off, too practiced, too smooth. But before he could press further, she shifted uncomfortably, glancing past him toward the stairs. "Well, good night, Walter," she said, turning back toward the guest room, "and thank you again." "Good night," he murmured, watching her go. The hallway fell silent once more, save for the distant hum of the storm still raging outside. Yet, as Walter retreated to his bedroom, he found himself unable to shake the image of Lena standing there in the shadows, her presence lingering like smoke. Morning brought sunlight streaming through the lace curtains and the comforting aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Walter stirred awake, surprised to find that he'd slept relatively well despite the odd encounter the night before. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, expecting to see Lena already up and making herself useful. It was what Margaret would have done, but instead, the house was eerily quiet. He poured himself a cup of coffee and ventured toward the guest room, knocking lightly on the door. "Lena, you awake?" No answer. Pushing the door open, he found the room empty. The bed was neatly made as though no one had slept in it, and her tote bag was gone. A sinking sensation settled in his stomach. Had she left during the night? Without so much as a word of thanks. But then he noticed something sitting on the bedside table. A folded piece of paper bearing his name in neat handwriting. Curious, he picked it up and unfolded it. "Dear Walter, thank you for your kindness last night. I wish I could explain everything, but some truths are harder to share than others. Please know that I meant no harm by staying here, and I hope someday you'll understand why I couldn't stay longer. Take care of yourself. Lena." Walter stared at the note, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. What did she mean by some truths? And why had she left so abruptly, without even waiting for breakfast? Before he could process any of it, another detail caught his eye. Beneath the note lay a single photograph, one he didn't recognize. It showed a younger Lena standing beside an older woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to Margaret. His breath hitched. No, it couldn't be, could it? For the first time in months, Walter felt the stirrings of something other than grief, something sharper, more urgent. Questions swirled in his mind like leaves caught in a whirlwind. Who was Lena, really? And what connection did she have to his late wife? Whatever the answers, one thing was certain. This stranger had brought more than just rain into his life. The morning after Lena's abrupt departure, Walter found himself unable to focus on anything but the photograph she'd left behind. He sat at the kitchen table, the image clutched in his hand as sunlight streamed through the window, casting sharp shadows across the worn wood surface. The resemblance was uncanny, too much so to dismiss as coincidence. Lena and Margaret together in a photograph? It made no sense. Margaret had never mentioned knowing anyone who looked like her, let alone someone young enough to be their granddaughter. And yet there it was. Undeniable proof that the woman who had spent the night under his roof wasn't entirely who she claimed to be. Determined to uncover the truth, Walter retrieved an old photo album from the top shelf of his closet. Dust clung to its leather cover, evidence of how long it had been since he'd last opened it. Inside were fragments of a life now distant. Snapshots of birthdays, holidays, and lazy summer afternoons. But what he sought wasn't nostalgia, it was clarity. He flipped through the pages slowly, his fingers trembling slightly with anticipation. Then, near the back, he froze. There she was, a younger version of the same face that had haunted him all morning. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 years old, standing beside her parents in front of a modest white house 2 doors down from where Walter and Margaret had lived decades earlier. Her name came rushing back to him like a forgotten melody. Emily Carter. The Carters had been neighbors for only a few short years before they vanished without explanation. Rumors swirled around town about financial troubles, shady dealings, and even whispers of something darker. Whatever the truth, the family disappeared overnight, leaving behind an empty house and unanswered questions. Walter remembered feeling uneasy about the whole affair, but had eventually pushed it out of his mind as time marched on. But this changed everything. How could Lena, or Emily, if that was indeed her real name, be connected to Margaret? And why would she show up on his doorstep after all these years? Later that afternoon, Walter decided to confront her. If she truly believed she owed him nothing, then fine, but he deserved answers. He drove to the care home Lena had mentioned during their brief conversation the previous night. The building was unremarkable, tucked away on the outskirts of town amidst fields of wildflowers and overgrown trees. Its sign read Willowbrook Care Home, though the letters were faded and chipped. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender sachets. An elderly receptionist glanced up from her crossword puzzle as Walter approached the desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "I'm looking for someone," Walter began, pulling the photograph from his pocket. "A nurse named Lena. She works here, doesn't she?" The woman studied the image carefully, her brow furrowing. Doesn't ring a bell. We don't have anyone by that name on staff." Walter's heart sank. "Are you sure? She said she worked here, young woman, maybe mid-20s, dark hair." "Nope," the receptionist replied firmly. "Sorry, sir, no one fitting that description." Before he could press further, a voice called out from behind him. "Mr. Granger?" Walter turned to see Lena standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a supply closet, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of recognition hanging heavy between them. "What are you doing here?" she finally asked, stepping closer. "I came to ask you some questions," Walter said, his tone sharper than he intended. "Like why you lied about working here, or why you look exactly like a girl I used to know." Lena hesitated, glancing nervously toward the receptionist before lowering her voice. "Not here," she murmured. "Please." Reluctantly, Walter followed her outside, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Once they were alone, she folded her arms tightly against the chill in the air, or perhaps against the discomfort of being cornered. "You're right," she admitted quietly. "I didn't work here. I just needed somewhere to go after leaving your house. Somewhere safe." "Safe from what?" Walter demanded. "And don't tell me you're not Emily Carter. That picture proves otherwise." Her jaw tightened, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "Yes, I'm Emily," she conceded. "But I'm not the person you think I am. My family. We left because we had to. Because people like you wouldn't understand." "Understand what?" Walter pressed, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You show up out of nowhere, lie to my face and leave cryptic notes about my wife. What do you want from me?" For a moment, Emily simply stared at him, her gaze searching his weathered features as though trying to gauge whether honesty might actually help. Finally, she sighed. "I didn't come looking for trouble, Mr. Granger. I came because I needed answers. About my mother, and about yours." Walter's breath caught. "What did you say?" "My mother knew yours," Emily explained softly. "They were friends once, close friends. Until something happened. Something bad. After that, we left, and I haven't been back since." "And Margaret?" Walter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does she have to do with any of this?" Emily hesitated again, biting her lip. When she spoke, her words carried a weight that sent a shiver down his spine. Your wife knew more than she let on. Maybe too much. Before Walter could respond, a car pulled into the lot, its engine rumbling loudly. Emily stiffened, her eyes darting toward the vehicle. I shouldn't have stayed this long, she muttered urgently. Listen, I'll explain everything, I promise. But not now, not here. With that, she turned and hurried away, disappearing into the maze of parked cars before Walter could stop her. He stood frozen in place, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was this woman, really? And what secrets had Margaret kept hidden from him all these years? As the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain on the horizon, Walter realized one thing for certain. The storm that had brought Lena into his life was far from over. The days following Lena's cryptic confession were a blur of restless nights and unanswered questions. Walter found himself pacing the creaky floors of his farmhouse, the photograph she'd left behind still clutched tightly in his hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something vast and unsettling, something that had been buried for decades but was now clawing its way back to the surface. To make matters worse, Margaret's absence felt heavier than ever. Her laughter no longer echoed through the halls, her gentle advice nowhere to be found when he needed it most. How could she have known Esther Moreland, or whoever Lena claimed her mother was, and not told him? The thought gnawed at him like an open wound. It wasn't until Dorothy arrived for tea later that week that Walter finally had someone else to share his burden with. Dorothy had been their neighbor for years before moving into town after her husband passed. Now widowed herself, she often stopped by unannounced, bringing gossip or baked goods, or both. Today, however, she seemed unusually subdued as she settled into the armchair by the fireplace. You look like you've seen a ghost, she remarked, eyeing him over the rim of her teacup. What's eating at you, Walter? He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But Dorothy had always been sharp-witted and observant. If anyone could shed light on the mystery, it was her. Do you remember the Carters? He asked carefully. The family who lived 2 houses down? Dorothy's eyebrows shot up. Good heavens, I haven't thought about them in years. Why bring them up now? Walter leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the emptiness of the house. Because I think I've met their daughter. That got her attention. She set her cup down with a soft clink, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Their daughter? Walter? That girl disappeared along with the rest of them. People said they skipped town because of some scandal. I never did find out what really happened. I know, Walter said grimly, but she's back. Or at least someone who looks exactly like her. Before Dorothy could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both turn. Lena stood there, framed by the doorway, looking every bit as startled as they were. Her presence filled the room with an uneasy tension, though she managed a polite smile. Oh, hello, she said softly. I didn't mean to interrupt. Dorothy stared at her, her teacup forgotten in her lap. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dorothy whispered almost to herself, Is that? Lena's composure faltered, just barely, but enough for Walter to notice. Without another word, she excused herself, murmuring something about needing fresh air before slipping out onto the porch. The screen door clicked shut behind her, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. Well, Dorothy said finally, breaking the quiet. She certainly looks familiar. She should, Walter replied, his voice tight with frustration. Her name isn't Lena, it's Emily Carter, or so she claims. And she says her mother knew Margaret. Dorothy's eyes widened. Esther Moreland's daughter? But that family, they were trouble, Walter. Real trouble. There were rumors about money laundering, shady business deals, you name it. When they left town, people breathed a sigh of relief. No one wanted to dig too deep into why. Money laundering? Walter echoed, his stomach sinking. What had Margaret gotten herself mixed up in? And there's more, Dorothy continued, leaning closer. Some folks whispered that Esther Moreland wasn't just involved in financial schemes. They said she dabbled in things best left alone. Secret societies, occult practices, all sorts of nonsense. Of course, no one could prove anything. But still. Walter rubbed his temples, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. Do you think Margaret knew about any of this? Dorothy hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Your wife was a good woman, Walter. If she kept secrets, it wasn't out of malice. Maybe she thought she was protecting you, or maybe she didn't know the full truth herself. Either way, I'd tread lightly if I were you. Later that evening, Walter sat alone in the living room, staring at the fire as it crackled and popped in the hearth. The storm outside had returned, rain tapping rhythmically against the windows. His mind raced with everything Dorothy had told him, and everything Lena hadn't. Why had Esther Moreland's daughter come back now after all these years? What did she want from him? And what role had Margaret played in whatever dark chapter the Morelands had written? As he mulled over these questions, a faint noise caught his attention. A soft creak from upstairs. At first, he assumed it was the house settling, but then came another sound, the unmistakable click of a door closing. His heart quickened. Lena, or Emily, was supposed to be staying in the guest room, but she hadn't mentioned going upstairs earlier. Slowly, he rose from his chair and climbed the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. When he reached the top, he saw that the door to his study was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Pushing it open cautiously, he found Lena sitting at his desk, rifling through a stack of old letters and documents. She looked up sharply, guilt flashing across her face. "What are you doing?" Walter demanded, his voice low but firm. "I'm sorry," she stammered, rising to her feet. "I didn't mean to snoop, I needed to know." "To know what?" he pressed, stepping closer. "What is it you're hiding from me?" For a moment, Lena simply stood there, her hands trembling at her sides. Then, with a resigned sigh, she sank back into the chair, defeated. "You're right to ask questions, Walter, but the answers aren't easy, and they might change how you see your wife forever." Her words sent a chill down his spine. Whatever secrets lay buried in the past, one thing was clear. Uncovering them would come at a cost. The next morning, Walter woke with a sense of unease that clung to him like the dampness of the storm still lingering outside. Lena, or Emily, as he now thought of her, had retreated to her room after their confrontation in the study, claiming exhaustion and refusing to say more. But sleep eluded Walter entirely. His mind churned over her cryptic warning. The answers aren't easy, and they might change how you see your wife forever. What could she possibly mean? Margaret had been the anchor of his life, steadfast and loving until the very end. How could anything unearthed now tarnish the memory of the woman who had stood by him through decades of joy and sorrow? By dawn, restless and unable to sit idle any longer, Walter decided to investigate further. There was one place in the house Lena hadn't yet explored, at least not to his knowledge. It was a small, locked room at the far end of the attic, a space Walter rarely ventured into himself. Margaret had always kept it meticulously organized, storing mementos and documents she deemed too precious or private for everyday handling. After her death, Walter had left it untouched, unwilling to disturb the sanctity of her keepsakes. Armed with the old brass key Margaret had once hung around her neck, a keepsake Walter now wore on a chain, he climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of pale light filtering through the cracked window panes. The air smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs, evoking memories of Margaret sorting through boxes while humming softly to herself. He approached the locked door, his pulse quickening. Inserting the key into the rusted lock, he turned it slowly, hearing the faint click as the mechanism gave way. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside. The room was exactly as Margaret had left it. Neat stacks of photo albums, shoe boxes filled with trinkets, and a single wooden chest pushed against the far wall. Walter's gaze fell immediately on the chest. It was slightly askew, its lid propped open just enough to reveal a corner of yellowed paper peeking out. Someone had been here. His stomach tightened as he crossed the room and knelt beside the chest. Inside were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, journals bound in leather, and other personal effects Margaret had saved over the years. But one item stood out. An envelope marked simply with the word "important" in Margaret's careful handwriting. Walter opened it carefully, unfolding the brittle pages within. The letter was dated mere weeks before Margaret's passing. Her handwriting was shaky but legible, each word imbued with urgency. "Dearest Walter, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I pray it never comes to this, but I must prepare you for the possibility. Over the years I've kept certain truths hidden, not out of malice, but because I feared what uncovering them might do to us. You deserve to know everything, though. Do not trust anyone from the Moreland family. They are dangerous, Walter. Their secrets run deeper than we ever imagined. If they come looking for me, or for you, do not let them in. Protect yourself, no matter what." Walter's breath caught in his throat. Beneath the chilling directive, a single sentence had been underlined heavily, as if Margaret wanted to ensure it would be impossible to overlook. Don't trust anyone from the Moreland family. He sat back on his heels, the weight of the words pressing down on him like a physical force. Margaret hadn't just known Esther Moreland. She had feared her so deeply that she'd gone to her grave keeping whatever secrets tied them together. And now, Emily Carter, Esther's daughter, was living under his roof. When Walter descended from the attic, his thoughts were a tangled mess. He found Lena sitting at the kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of tea. She looked up when he entered, her expression wary but resigned. "You went into the attic," she said quietly, stating it as fact rather than accusation. "Yes," Walter replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil roiling inside him. "And I found something you should see." He slid the letter across the table toward her, watching as her eyes scanned the page. Her hand trembled slightly as she read, her face growing paler with each passing second. When she reached the underlined line, she stopped, her gaze flicking up to meet his. "She warned you," Lena murmured, almost to herself. "I didn't think she'd go that far." "So you knew," Walter said, his tone hardening. "You knew about my wife and your mother, and you didn't tell me." "I didn't know everything," Lena admitted, setting the letter down carefully. "Only bits and pieces. My mother, she wasn't well, Walter. She got involved with people, organizations that promised power, protection, wealth. Things spiraled out of control, and when the truth came to light, we had to leave. Quickly." "And Margaret?" Walter pressed. "What part did she play in all of this?" Lena hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "She tried to help us. Your wife was kind-hearted, maybe too much so. She believed she could reason with my mother, convince her to step away from whatever schemes she was entangled in. But things went wrong. Very wrong. Someone betrayed us, all of us, and suddenly our lives were in danger. Walter stared at her, struggling to reconcile the woman he loved with the shadowy figure Lena described. Why didn't she tell me? Why keep this from me? Because she loved you, Lena said simply, and because she knew you wouldn't understand, or maybe she couldn't bear to drag you into it. Either way, she paid the price. What price? Walter demanded, his voice rising. Margaret died peacefully in her sleep. No, Lena corrected softly, shaking her head. That's what you were meant to believe. But the night she passed, there was someone else in the house. Someone who made sure she wouldn't talk. The room seemed to tilt beneath Walter's feet. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. Who? Lena met his gaze, her own eyes brimming with tears. I don't know, not for certain, but I think whoever it was is still out there, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets, even now. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Walter felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him, leaving him unmoored. Everything he thought he knew about Margaret and about himself was being rewritten before his eyes. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are you here, Lena? What do you want from me? Her answer was simple yet devastating. To find out who killed my mother, and yours. The next day, Walter drove into town with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp autumn morning bathed in golden sunlight. But the weight of Margaret's letter and Lena's revelations pressed heavily on him, urging him forward. If answers lay buried in the past, then it was time to dig them up. He parked outside the small public library, its brick facade weathered but welcoming. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a familiar scent that reminded him of countless afternoons spent researching history or helping Margaret track down genealogical records. Today, however, his mission was far more personal. At the reference desk, an elderly librarian named Mrs. Hargrove greeted him warmly. Walter Granger, it's been ages since we've seen you here. Good to see you too, Eleanor, Walter replied, managing a polite smile. I'm looking for some old newspapers, specifically from the late 80s. Mrs. Hargrove nodded knowingly. Microfilm, I assume. Follow me. She led him to a corner of the library, where a bulky microfilm reader sat collecting dust. After retrieving several reels labeled Willow Creek Gazette, 1987, 1990, she left him to his task. Walter settled into the chair, threading the first reel onto the machine with practiced ease. As the images flickered to life on the screen, he began scrolling through headlines about local elections, high school sports victories, and church bake sales. It wasn't until he reached October 1989 that he found what he was searching for, a front-page article titled, Hospice Scandal Rocks Willow Creek. Allegations of Unethical Euthanasia Surface. His breath hitched as he read further. According to the report, authorities had launched an investigation into suspicious deaths at Serenity Hospice, a facility once considered a model of compassionate care. At the center of the scandal was Esther Moreland, a nurse accused of administering lethal doses of medication to terminally ill patients without proper consent, or worse, under coercion. Sources indicate that Miss Moreland may have been acting under orders from an unknown party within the hospice administration, the article stated. However, before investigators could question her, Miss Moreland disappeared along with her young daughter, Emily Carter, age 8, leaving behind no trace. Walter's hands trembled as he skimmed the rest of the piece. The reporter speculated that Esther might have fled out of fear or guilt, but noted that key evidence linking her directly to the crimes remained elusive. Without witnesses willing to testify, the case eventually stalled, leaving unanswered questions and lingering mistrust in its wake. But one line near the end of the article stopped him cold. Some speculate that Miss Moreland's involvement extended beyond mere compliance, hinting at ties to shadowy organizations rumored to operate in the area during that time period. Shadowy organizations. The same phrase Lena had used when describing her mother's entanglements. Walter leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Had Esther truly been complicit in these horrific acts, or had she been manipulated by forces far darker than anyone realized? As he scrolled through subsequent issues, another detail emerged. Margaret's name appeared in a follow-up story as a volunteer at Serenity Hospice during the same time frame. Though she wasn't implicated in any wrongdoing, her association with the facility added yet another layer to the tangled web connecting her to Esther Moreland, and by extension, to Lena. By the time Walter returned home, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the fields surrounding his farmhouse. Lena was sitting on the porch swing, wrapped in a sweater despite the mild temperature. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded but expectant. "I went to the library," Walter said without preamble, holding up a folder containing photocopies of the articles he'd found. "You were right about your mother. She was involved in something terrible." Lena nodded slowly, accepting the folder from him. Her eyes scanned the pages silently, though Walter doubted she needed to read them. She already knew the truth. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "She thought she was doing the right thing at first," Lena admitted, folding the papers carefully and setting them aside. "They promised her money, protection, even salvation. But once she saw what they were really capable of, it was too late. She tried to leave, but they wouldn't let her go." "And Margaret?" Walter asked, his tone heavy with unspoken grief. "What role did she play?" Lena hesitated, choosing her words with care. "Your wife tried to help us escape. That's why we came to your town, to disappear. But someone tipped them off. My mother, she sacrificed herself to give me a chance to get away. And Margaret, she stayed behind to cover our tracks." Walter sank onto the porch steps, the pieces falling into place like shards of a shattered mirror. Margaret hadn't died peacefully in her sleep. She'd been silenced, murdered, because she knew too much. Because she tried to protect a frightened child and her desperate mother. "But who?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Who killed her?" Lena shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know, not yet. But whoever it is, they're still watching, waiting." A chill ran down Walter's spine as he glanced toward the tree line at the edge of his property. For the first time in months, he felt truly alive, but also acutely aware of how fragile life could be. The past wasn't just knocking at his door, it had barged in, demanding answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Yet, deep down, he knew one thing for certain. Justice for Margaret and for Esther wouldn't come easily. But if uncovering the truth meant confronting the darkness head-on, then so be it. He owed them both that much. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the farmhouse in shadows that danced across the walls. Walter sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea he hadn't touched. The weight of everything he'd learned pressed down on him like a leaden blanket. Lena's confession about her mother and Margaret's involvement had left him reeling. But now she was asking him to believe something even more unfathomable. "My mother wasn't guilty," Lena said quietly, her voice trembling as she stood by the window, staring out into the darkening fields. She didn't kill those people. She tried to stop it. Walter looked up sharply, his brow furrowing. Stop what? The euthanasia program, Lena replied, turning to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, evidence of tears shed earlier, but there was a steely resolve in her expression now. It wasn't just unethical. It was part of something bigger, something organized and funded by people who wanted to control how and when certain patients died. They called it mercy, but it was anything but. And your mother? Walter asked, his tone guarded. What did she do? She blew the whistle, or tried to, Lena explained. But someone intercepted her report before it reached the authorities. That someone was Ellen Granger. Walter froze, the name hitting him like a physical blow. Ellen, the woman he had loved first, years before Margaret came into his life. Ellen, who had passed away long ago after moving away from Willow Creek under mysterious circumstances. He had mourned her loss deeply back then, though time and Margaret's love had eventually softened the ache. Now, Lena was implicating her in one of the darkest chapters of their town's history. That's impossible, Walter said firmly, shaking his head. Ellen would never... She worked at Serenity Hospice during the same period my mother did, Lana interrupted, her voice rising slightly. She knew what was happening, and instead of stopping it, she covered it up, to protect herself or maybe because they threatened her. Either way, she framed my mother to buy herself time. Walter clenched his fists, fighting against the anger bubbling inside him. You're accusing my wife, my first wife, of murder, of framing an innocent woman? I'm not accusing anyone, Lena shot back, stepping closer. I'm telling you what I've pieced together over the years. My mother kept journals, notes detailing every step she took to expose the truth. One name kept appearing. Ellen Granger. She was the key to everything. Walter pushed himself to his feet, pacing the length of the kitchen. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of Ellen he had cherished with the person Lena described. Could she really have been capable of such deception? Or was this all some elaborate lie meant to shift blame onto someone who couldn't defend herself? Why are you here, Lena? He demanded, stopping abruptly to face her. If all you wanted was answers, why come to me? Why dredge up the past now? Because I need to know the truth, Lena cried, frustration breaking through her composure. For 25 years, I've lived with the knowledge that my mother was accused of crimes she didn't commit. I grew up hiding, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if the people who destroyed our lives would find me. When I heard about your wife's death, I thought, maybe she could help me understand what really happened. Maybe she knew something Ellen didn't want anyone else to discover. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Walter sank back into his chair, feeling the ground beneath him shift once again. If Lena was right, if Ellen had indeed played a role in covering up the scandal, then Margaret might have uncovered the truth during her volunteer work at the hospice. That would explain why she had tried to help Esther and Emily escape. It would also explain why someone had silenced her. But one question remained unanswered. Who was pulling the strings? Who had orchestrated the entire scheme and continued to hide in the shadows decades later? As the silence stretched on, Lena moved to sit across from Walter, her posture defeated yet determined. I didn't come here to hurt anyone, she said softly. I came because I'm tired of running, tired of living in fear. If finding the truth means risking my life, then so be it, but I can't do it alone. Walter studied her for a long moment, seeing not just the stranger who had appeared on his doorstep, but also the frightened child who had lost everything. Whatever her motives, whatever secrets she still carried, he couldn't deny the sincerity in her voice. Finally, he nodded slowly. If what you're saying is true, if Ellen was involved, then we owe it to Margaret to uncover the rest of the story, for her sake, and for yours. Lena exhaled shakily, relief washing over her features. Thank you, Walter. I know this isn't easy. No, he agreed, his gaze drifted toward the photographs on the mantel. It isn't. But sometimes, the hardest things are the ones worth doing. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows as though warning them of storms yet to come. Walter knew they were standing on dangerous ground, chasing truths that might destroy them both. Yet, for the first time in months, he felt alive, not just surviving, but fighting for something greater than himself. And as he rose to pour another cup of tea, he realized that perhaps grief wasn't meant to be endured alone. Perhaps it was meant to bring people together, even strangers bound by pain and secrets, in the pursuit of justice. The attic was cold and dim, the only light filtering through the small, grimy window that overlooked the backyard. Walter knelt amid stacks of boxes and dusty relics from his past life with Ellen, searching for something, anything, that might corroborate Lena's claims. He had spent years avoiding this part of the house after Margaret came into his life, unwilling to stir up old memories or confront ghosts he thought long buried. But now, those ghosts were clawing their way back, demanding answers. His fingers brushed against a faded cardboard box tucked away in the far corner, its label scrawled in Ellen's neat handwriting. Personal documents. Heart pounding, he pulled it down and opened it carefully, revealing a jumble of papers, photographs, and other mementos. Near the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was an old VHS tape marked simply, 1989 safe copy. Walter's breath caught. The year alone sent a shiver down his spine. Whatever Ellen had deemed important enough to preserve and safeguard, it clearly tied directly to the scandal at Serenity Hospice. With trembling hands, he carried the tape downstairs and inserted it into the ancient VCR player Margaret had refused to throw out despite its obsolescence. At first, static filled the screen, white noise crackling like distant thunder. Then, abruptly, the image cleared, revealing grainy footage shot from what appeared to be a hidden camera mounted high on a wall. The room below was unmistakably part of the hospice, a quiet, sterile space where medical equipment lined the walls and soft lighting bathed the scene in an eerie glow. Two figures stood near a gurney, their faces partially obscured but recognizable enough to send Walter's pulse racing. One was undoubtedly Esther Moreland, her posture tense, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The other... Walter leaned closer, squinting at the screen. It was Ellen. There was no mistaking her sharp features or the way she moved with purpose, even as her voice, distorted slightly by poor audio quality, carried an edge of desperation. "You're asking me to cross a line I can't come back from," Esther said, her tone low but firm. "This isn't mercy, it's murder." "It's compassion," Ellen replied, her words clipped. "These people are suffering. We're giving them peace." "No," Esther snapped, stepping forward. "You're playing God. And if you think I won't report every last detail of this operation, you're wrong." Ellen hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door before lowering her voice. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? If you go public, they'll destroy you, and everyone you care about. Is that what you want?" Esther didn't flinch. "Better than living with blood on my hands." The recording cut off suddenly, plunging the screen back into static. Walter rewound it instinctively, hoping for more clarity, but when the footage resumed, Large sections were visibly burned, the tape warping and distorting until nothing coherent remained. Frustrated, he ejected the cassette and examined it closely. Someone had deliberately tampered with the tape, erasing key moments while leaving just enough behind to hint at the truth. Lena found him slumped on the couch, the tape resting on the coffee table like a smoking gun. She took one look at his stricken expression and knew immediately what he'd discovered. "You saw it," she said softly, sitting beside him. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "It's not proof, not exactly, but it's enough to make me wonder. Who was Ellen really working for, and why would she risk everything to protect them?" Lena reached for the tape, turning it over in her hands. Maybe she didn't start out as part of whatever group was running the program. Maybe they coerced her, or promised her something she couldn't refuse. People do desperate things when they're scared. Walter shook his head, guilt gnawing at him. "I should have known, should have seen it." "How could you?" Lena countered gently. "She left before things escalated. By the time you married Margaret, she was already gone. You weren't meant to find out." "But Margaret did," Walter murmured, his voice heavy with sorrow. "That's why she tried to help your mother escape. She must have uncovered the truth somehow, maybe even confronted Ellen about it. And someone killed her for it." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the distant hum of the storm still lingering outside. Walter stared at the tape, pieces of the puzzle falling into place but leaving gaping holes where trust had once been. Ellen wasn't the woman he had loved and mourned all these years. She was a stranger, a participant in a conspiracy so dark it defied comprehension. Yet, even as betrayal burned within him, another emotion surfaced: determination. Whoever had orchestrated the scandal at Serenity Hospice, whoever had silenced both Esther and Margaret, was still out there, and Walter owed it to them, to himself, to uncover the rest of the story. "What happens now?" Lena asked quietly, breaking the silence. Walter looked at her, seeing not just the frightened girl she had once been, but also the woman determined to reclaim her future. "Now," he said firmly, "we find out who's pulling the strings, and we make sure they pay for what they've done." Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the fields in stark relief. The storm was far from over, and neither was their fight for justice. The cemetery was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves stirred by a restless autumn breeze. Walter stood before Ellen's grave, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. The headstone was simple, bearing only her name and the years of her birth and death, a stark reminder of how little remained when life ended. For decades, he had visited this spot sporadically, leaving flowers or simply standing in silence, remembering the woman who had once been his entire world. But today he came not as a grieving lover, but as a man searching for answers. "Ellen," he began softly, his voice barely audible over the wind, "I don't know what to believe anymore. You are part of me, always will be, but if you lied, if you covered up something so terrible, then I need to understand why." He paused, staring at the carved letters of her name. How could the woman he had loved have been involved in such darkness? And yet, the tape, and Lena's words, refused to let him dismiss the possibility. He clenched his jaw, fighting back the wave of anger and betrayal that threatened to overwhelm him. "You owe me the truth," he whispered, though he knew no reply would come. Margaret deserved better. So did Esther. If you had a hand in what happened to them. His voice trailed off as footsteps approached from behind. Turning, he saw an elderly man shuffling toward him, leaning heavily on a cane. It took Walter a moment to recognize him. Harold Finch, a former colleague of Ellen's at the Serenity Hospice. They hadn't spoken since Ellen's passing, and seeing him now felt like stepping into another lifetime. "Walter Granger," Harold said, his tone gruff but tinged with sadness. "Never thought I'd see you here again." "Harold," Walter replied, nodding politely. "I didn't expect company." "I heard you've been asking questions," Harold continued, stopping a few feet away. His gaze flicked to Ellen's grave, then back to Walter. "About the hospice, about Esther Moreland." Walter stiffened, unsure whether to deny it or press further. In the end, curiosity won out. "I'm trying to understand what happened back then. Margaret, she got caught up in it somehow, and now—" He hesitated, glancing toward the farmhouse in the distance. "Now, there are people saying things that make no sense." Harold sighed, lowering himself onto a nearby bench with visible effort. "Sit down, son. This isn't a conversation for standing." Reluctantly, Walter joined him, bracing himself for whatever revelations lay ahead. "Ellen was a good nurse," Harold began, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "But she made mistakes, just like the rest of us. One mistake in particular haunted her until the day she died." "What kind of mistake?" Walter asked, his pulse quickening. Harold looked away, his expression pained. "She administered medication to a patient without proper authorization. Said she was following orders, but when the fallout hit, she took the blame alone. She told me once, it was the only time she ever spoke about it, that she regretted letting others twist her actions into something worse." Walter frowned, the pieces beginning to shift in his mind. "Others? You mean Esther?" Harold nodded slowly. "Ellen always insisted Esther turned one bad decision into many, that she used it as leverage, to expose the hospice, to bring everyone down. Ellen believed Esther wanted revenge, not justice." "But Lena says her mother was innocent," Walter countered, his voice rising slightly. "That she tried to stop the program, not perpetuate it." Harold shrugged, his weathered face unreadable. Maybe she did. Or maybe she saw an opportunity to clear her own name while dragging others through the mud. Either way, Ellen paid the price. She left town, changed her number, cut ties with everyone, including you. All because she couldn't bear the guilt of what she'd done, or what she'd allowed to happen. Walter sat in stunned silence, Harold's words echoing in his mind. Could Ellen have been manipulated by Esther, just as Lena claimed her mother had been framed? Or had Harold's loyalty to Ellen blinded him to the truth? By the time Walter returned home, night had fallen, casting the farmhouse in shadows. Lena was waiting for him in the living room, her expression wary but resolute. "Well?" she asked, rising from the armchair as he entered. "Did you learn anything?" Walter hesitated, torn between the conflicting narratives vying for dominance in his mind. Finally, he sank onto the couch, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Harold Finch confirmed Ellen made a mistake," he admitted. "But he also said your mother exploited it, turned it into something bigger than it was." Lena's eyes widened, her composure faltering for the first time. "No, that's not true. My mother wasn't like that. She fought against the program, not for herself, but for the patients who couldn't fight anymore." "And Ellen?" Walter shot back, his voice tinged with bitterness. "What about her? Was she just a pawn in all of this, or was she complicit in the very thing your mother tried to stop?" Lena opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, frustration tightening her features. "I don't know what Harold told you, Walter, but my mother kept journals. Detailed accounts of everything she uncovered. If you read them, you'd see the truth." Walter stared at her, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. Loyalty to Ellen warred with the growing suspicion that Lena might be telling the truth, or at least part of it. Whoever was responsible for the scandal at Serenity Hospice, whoever had silenced both Margaret and Esther, was still hiding in plain sight. And until they unearthed the full story, neither of them could afford to trust anyone completely, not even each other. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows as if warning them of storms yet to come. Walter realized with grim certainty that the hardest truths were still buried, and uncovering them would require sacrifices neither of them was prepared to make. The farmhouse was unnervingly quiet when Walter awoke the next morning, his head foggy and his body heavy with an unshakable lethargy. He had slept fitfully, plagued by dreams that blurred into nightmares. Ellen's face morphing into Esther's. Margaret's voice calling to him from some distant shore. As he shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Lena greeted him with a warm smile. "I made tea," she said softly, holding out a steaming mug. "Thought you could use something to wake you up." Walter hesitated, studying her expression for any trace of deception. Her demeanor seemed genuine enough, but the weight of their recent confrontations lingered between them like a storm cloud. Still, he accepted the mug, murmuring a quiet thank you before taking a cautious sip. The chamomile blend was soothing, its floral aroma filling the room as he settled at the table. They exchanged small talk for a while, discussing nothing of consequence, weather patterns, old recipes, memories of simpler times. But as the minutes passed, Walter began to feel off. A dull ache spread through his chest, followed by a wave of dizziness so sudden it nearly knocked him off his chair. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening as panic set in. "Lena," he managed to choke out, his vision swimming. "What did you—" Her expression shifted then, the mask of kindness slipping away to reveal something colder, more calculating. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate as she reached for the phone on the counter. "It's not personal, Walter," she said quietly, dialing a number with practiced ease. "But you chose her side over mine. You protected Ellen's secrets instead of seeking justice for my mother." Walter tried to rise, to protest, but his limbs refused to obey. His heart pounded erratically, each beat feeling like a hammer against his ribs. The world around him dimmed, sounds fading into a distant hum as Lena's voice grew sharper, clearer. "He doesn't know what she did to Mom," she said into the phone, her tone urgent. "He needs to pay for protecting her." Panic surged through Walter, sharpening his senses even as his body betrayed him. Poison. It had to be poison. Had Lena slipped something into the tea? Or had she planned this all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? His mind raced, fragments of memory colliding in a chaotic jumble. Lena's resemblance to Esther. Her insistence on uncovering the truth. The journals she claimed would exonerate her mother. Was any of it real, or had she been manipulating him from the start? As consciousness slipped further away, Walter caught glimpses of movement in the periphery. Lena pacing the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. The flicker of headlights outside as another vehicle pulled into the driveway. Shadows loomed larger, darker, until they consumed everything. When awareness returned, it came in flashes. Disjointed images and muffled voices struggling to pierce the haze enveloping his mind. He was lying on the couch in the living room, a blanket draped loosely over his trembling form. Lena stood nearby, arguing with someone whose face remained obscured by the dim light. "You said you'd handle this," the stranger snapped, their voice low and menacing. "Not leave loose ends." "I didn't plan for him to find the tape," Lena shot back, her frustration evident. "But we can still fix this. Just give me time. Time. Walter clung to the word, forcing himself to focus despite the poison coursing through his veins. If he could stay conscious long enough, maybe, just maybe, he could turn the tide. Summoning every ounce of strength, he forced his fingers to curl around the edge of the blanket, dragging it slowly toward him. Beneath it lay the old brass key to the locked attic room, which he had absent-mindedly tucked into his pocket earlier. With painstaking effort, he slid it free, concealing it in his palm as Lena turned back toward him. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her tone falsely sweet. "Still with us?" Walter groaned, feigning greater weakness than he felt. "What happened?" "A little accident," she replied smoothly, kneeling beside him. "But don't worry, everything will be fine, as long as you cooperate." Cooperate. The word sent a fresh surge of adrenaline coursing through him. Whatever Lena wanted, whatever she planned to extract from him, he couldn't let her succeed. Not without a fight. Summoning the last reserves of his energy, Walter lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with surprising force. Startled, she cried out, dropping the phone as he twisted the key into her line of sight. "If you think I'm going down without answers," he rasped, his voice raw but resolute, "you're wrong." For a moment, fear flickered across Lena's face. A crack in the facade she had so carefully constructed. Then the stranger moved closer, their silhouette looming large as they raised something metallic and gleaming. "No more games," the figure growled, and darkness descended once more. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled Walter's nostrils as he slowly came to, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. His throat was parched, his body heavy with fatigue, but the sharp clarity of survival pulsed through him like a lifeline. He wasn't dead. Not yet. "Thank God," Dorothy murmured from beside the bed, her weathered hands clasped tightly around a crumpled tissue. "You scared me half to death." "What happened?" Walter croaked, his voice barely audible. "I found you," she replied, leaning forward. Her eyes were red-rimmed, evidence of tears shed in worry. "I stopped by the house to check on you. Thank heavens I did. Lena was gone, but there was tea spilled all over the kitchen floor, and this strange residue in the mug. I called an ambulance right away." Walter closed his eyes, fragments of memory rushing back. The dizziness, the phone call, Lena's cold betrayal. "She poisoned me," he whispered hoarsely. "Lena tried to kill me." Dorothy's expression hardened. "That girl has some explaining to do, but don't you worry about that now. You're safe here. Safe, but far from answers." As the fog of sedation lifted, Walter felt the weight of unresolved questions pressing down on him once again. If Lena had fled, where had she gone? And what secrets had driven her to such extremes? By the time he was discharged from the hospital 2 days later, Walter had pieced together enough to form a plan. Dorothy had stayed by his side throughout, offering both moral support and practical assistance. It was she who suggested checking Ellen's belongings one final time, specifically the safety deposit box at the local bank that Margaret had mentioned years ago but never opened. With trembling hands, Walter retrieved the small metal container from the vault and carried it back to the farmhouse. Inside, nestled among old deeds and insurance policies, was a single envelope addressed to him in Ellen's familiar handwriting. His heart raced as he unfolded the brittle pages within. "Dearest Walter, if you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. I've kept this secret for too long, hoping it would stay buried forever. But if the truth comes out, if anyone finds out what I did, I need you to understand why. Esther Moreland came to me one night, desperate. Her child's father, a man already dying of cancer, was suffering unimaginably. She begged me to end his pain, to give him peace. I couldn't refuse her. Together, we administered the final dose, ensuring he passed quietly and without fear. It was supposed to be an act of mercy, nothing more. But Esther, she saw an opportunity. She used what she knew to manipulate me, threatening to expose everything unless I helped her uncover the larger conspiracy at the hospice. When the scandal broke, she vanished, taking the evidence with her. I covered it up, for you, for us, for the life we built together. Forgive me, Walter. I only wanted to protect you. Walter stared at the letter, his mind reeling. Ellen hadn't been innocent, but neither had she been entirely guilty. She had acted out of compassion, only to be ensnared by Esther's desperation and cunning. And when the scandal erupted, Esther had framed her, using their shared secret as leverage to escape. But why had Lena returned now, after all these years? Was it truly justice she sought, or revenge? As the days passed, Walter scoured the house for any trace of Lena, searching for clues she might have left behind. In the attic, he discovered a notebook tucked beneath a loose floorboard, a journal belonging to Esther Moreland. Its pages chronicled her growing paranoia and determination to expose the hospice's dark operations, interspersed with cryptic references to someone named Dr. Caldwell. A quick search of old newspaper clippings revealed that Dr. Caldwell had been the head administrator at Serenity Hospice during the scandal. Unlike Esther and Ellen, however, he had weathered the storm unscathed, retiring quietly shortly thereafter. Walter's blood ran cold as realization dawned. Caldwell had orchestrated the entire program, and Lena had likely tracked him down. Armed with this new information, Walter made a decision. Whatever Lena intended to do next, he couldn't let her face it alone. Justice for Margaret and Esther meant confronting the true mastermind behind the conspiracy and ensuring Caldwell paid for his crimes. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of change. Walter locked the farmhouse door behind him and climbed into his car, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and unanswered questions. But for the first time in months, he felt alive, not just surviving, but fighting for something greater than himself. And as he drove toward town, the sun breaking through the clouds, he vowed silently to see it through. To honor Margaret's memory, uncover the truth, and ensure no one else suffered because of secrets buried too deep. The farmhouse was cloaked in darkness when Walter awoke to the faint creak of floorboards. At first, he thought it might be the wind or his imagination, an echo of the paranoia that had gripped him since Lena's betrayal. But then came the soft shuffle of footsteps retreating down the hallway, deliberate and unhurried. He rose quietly, ignoring the lingering ache in his muscles from the poison that had nearly claimed his life. The house felt different somehow, charged with an energy both familiar and foreign. As he stepped into the living room, he found her standing by the mantel, silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the windows. Lena. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze with eyes that were weary but resolute. Gone was the cold calculation he'd seen before. In its place was something softer, sadder, a reflection of the frightened girl she had once been. "I didn't come to hurt you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just needed to see this place one last time." Walter studied her carefully, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was exhaustion, the kind that comes not from sleepless nights but from carrying secrets too heavy to bear alone. "What changed your mind?" he asked. his tone measured but tinged with caution. "Last I saw, you were ready to finish what you started." Lena hesitated, glancing toward the photographs lining the mantel. Her fingers brushed lightly over the frame containing Margaret's smiling face. "I realized I don't know who I am anymore," she admitted softly. "All these years I've hated Ellen Granger, and by extension you, for protecting her. But now I wonder if my mother was any better, if she used people the same way they used her." Walter exhaled sharply, the weight of her words settling heavily between them. He had spent weeks unraveling the tangled web of truths and lies surrounding Esther Moreland, Ellen, and Margaret, and yet, even now, he wasn't sure where justice ended and vengeance began. "I found her journal," he said after a pause, gesturing toward the notebook resting on the coffee table. "It told me things I'm not sure I wanted to know. About Dr. Caldwell, about your mother, about why she left." Lena nodded, though tears glistened in her eyes. "She always said she did it for me, for us. But I don't want to live like that, Walter. I don't want to become someone who hurts others because they're afraid of being hurt themselves." Her vulnerability struck him deeply, reminding him of Margaret's quiet strength in the face of adversity. For all their differences, Lena and Margaret shared a common thread: the desire to protect those they loved, even at a great personal cost. Before either of them could say more, Lena reached into her coat pocket and placed 2 items on the mantel: a photograph of a young Esther Moreland, radiant with hope and innocence, and a folded piece of paper. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the night as silently as she had arrived. Walter waited until the sound of her footsteps faded completely before approaching the mantel. Picking up the note, he unfolded it carefully, his heart pounding as he read the words scrawled in Lena's trembling handwriting. "I don't know what to believe anymore, but I won't become like her." The simplicity of the message hit him like a punch to the gut. Lena wasn't running away. Not entirely. She was choosing a path forward, however uncertain, guided by a resolve to break free from the cycle of pain and retribution that had defined her family's legacy. Holding the photograph in one hand and the note in the other, Walter stepped out onto the porch. The rain had returned, soaking the fields and filling the air with the earthy scent of wet soil. He stood there for a long moment, letting the drops fall around him, mingling with the tears he refused to shed. In his hands, he carried the truth, a burden he never asked for but could no longer escape. It was a story of love and loss, of kindness twisted into cruelty, of choices made in desperation and their far-reaching consequences. Ellen had acted out of compassion, only to be ensnared by guilt. Esther had sought justice, only to sacrifice her humanity along the way. And Margaret had tried to mend what was broken, paying the ultimate price for her courage. As the storm raged on, Walter realized that he, too, was part of the tapestry, a man saved by love, yet forever haunted by the sins buried within it. There would be no absolution, no tidy resolution, only the memory heavy weight of lives intertwined, bound together by secrets that refused to stay buried. And so, with rain streaming down his face, Walter walked into the night, not to chase answers, but to carry the lessons of the past into an uncertain future. Whatever lay ahead, he vowed to honor Margaret's memory by choosing compassion over fear, light over shadow. Because sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones worth holding on to, and the hardest choices are the ones that set us free.